Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's my pleasure to be joined by two great contemporary institution builders to talk about whether and how Jews and Christians can help to renew America's institutions. Of course, the question could hardly be more important. We Americans are living through something of a social crisis that, in a lot of ways, is an institutional crisis. It's marked by a breakdown of family and community, by a loss of trust in core institutions, by the rise of alienation, isolation, even despair in the lives of too many of our fellow Americans, a kind of coming apart that presents itself in lots of different sorts of symptoms. All of that has been accelerated and made worse by attacks against some of the foundations of American life by an increasingly aggressive cultural progressivism that sees traditional American institutions as fundamentally unjust and corrupt and wants to uproot them. Defending our traditions and our institutions requires a recommitment to them, a reassertion of their value and their promise. And that sort of recommitment, almost by definition, would have to be rooted in religious and educational institutions. American civil society has always depended for its strength on the integrity and confidence of America's tradition-minded religious communities. And in this moment, it certainly seems like the future depends on those communities above all. Eric Cohen and Robert Nicholson, in running Tikvah and Philos, confront this crisis every day, and so have had to think about it both deeply and concretely, which makes them just the right people to help us understand this challenge and also see where there might be causes for hope and for confidence in the future. Gentlemen, it's really great to be with you. I'd like to start by diving into the challenge just a little. Eric, I'll begin with you. Thinking as the leader of an institution devoted to helping American Jews navigate this terrain, what worries you most about the cultural situation in America now? How do you think about the challenge?
Well, Yuval, thanks for setting this up, and Robert for engaging with me in this conversation. So let me start big picture. I think big picture, the challenge is how do you build and strengthen traditional communities in an untraditional age? When you look at some of the major institutions of American life, the universities, the media, now our biggest corporations, they have very strong views and very untraditional views on questions of family and sexuality, questions of patriotism and nationalism, including the meaning of Israel, and questions about the role of religion itself in American life. And so I think the big picture challenge for Jews and Christians is how do we strengthen and preserve traditional educational institutions, religious institutions, the soul-shaping institutions of our society in a culture where the winds are pushing in the opposite direction. And I would also say, big picture, that America itself depends on this. America depends, to modify Burke's famous phrase, on the little religious platoons of American society. They are the nurseries of American virtue now. And so I think Jews, Christians, all religious communities of faith have a big responsibility. Now, thinking specifically from a Jewish perspective, I'd say there are three things that worry me, three challenges that have to be met. The first is the fact that the Jewish community, the Jewish population in America is so clustered in a handful of places, especially New York, New Jersey, California, where the progressive ethos is especially strong. Now, I don't think I'm going to have a lot of success calling for an aliyah to Wyoming, but I do think as we think about the renewal of American federalism, the fact that there will be, I think, increasingly different cultures in different states, and some states that are stronger defenders of religious liberty, stronger advocates for things like school choice. I think Jews have a strategic imperative to think about their geography and how it relates to their moral renewal, their strength of their own institutions. I'd say the second thing that worries me from a particularly Jewish perspective, though I think it's a broader American challenge, is what's going on with universities. For Jews, universities have been a kind of mythic, important institution. They've been the gateway to American prosperity, American integration, American success. And for very good reason, Jews in past generations revered the universities. But we now see an inverted situation where many of our leading universities are peculiarly obsessed with the Jews, with Israel, in a way that is unhealthy. And in general, universities, I think, have an ethos and a culture that cuts against the very kind of traditional Jewish values that we want to build. And so the university problem is an American problem, but it's also a Jewish problem. And I'd say finally, my third concern from a Jewish perspective comes from a different direction. And it has to do with the importance of the yeshiva world, the Orthodox world, those parts of American Jewry that actually really are flourishing in important ways, high birth rates, overfilled schools, growth organically, pretty high retention rates in preserving Jewish culture from one generation to the next. But I think that part of American Jewry is now going to become the leaders of American Jewry itself. And I think they have to begin to think more broadly, more politically, think about the general education of their young people, perhaps recognize the fact that many of the political leaders in Jewish history, one could even say Moses, right, educated in the Egyptian palace, but certainly people like Herzl, Jabotinsky, they had a kind of understanding of modern politics and modern culture in their times that I think people in the yeshiva world in America now need to get if they're going to emerge as the leaders of American Jewry. So those are some of the challenges I see both in general for America and specifically for the Jewish community.
Robert, obviously there are some shared concerns between Jews and Christians, as Eric suggests, on this kind of front. There are also some significant differences. How do you think about the overall cultural situation? Where are the key points of challenge or concern that you start out with?
It's a great question, Yuval, and happy to be here talking about it. It's the question that drives everything I do at the Philos Project. Our mission is to promote positive Christian engagement in the Near East, major part of which is engagement with Israel and the Jewish people and how that people are connected to that region and to us as Christians. But in doing all the work that we do, and we do a lot of it, and it's really across the board, whether it's content or trips and all these different things, the more I've realized that the problem we're dealing with is much farther upstream. And every year that passes, I'm more convinced of this. And for me, the difficulties I face in my work relating Christians back to their spiritual homeland are very much connected to what we're seeing happen in this country. It's all part of a piece. And I think for me, the root problem, and this is very abstract, but I'll start here. The root problem is a loss of America's mythic world picture, if you want to call it that. It is a loss of the worldview that was the basis upon which this country was founded. There were different intellectual streams that created America, but the most important, certainly from my perspective, is that issuing from Jerusalem. And of course, as a Christian, for me, that means that Christians have a special burden to ensure that cultural heritage is revived and those flames are fanned. I think a couple of specific problems I'll mention here. One is, as I mentioned, I think a misunderstanding of the problem, and I see this across every sector of Christian life, Protestant, Catholic, both. There's a sense that there's a problem. Everybody agrees on that, but the diagnoses of that problem don't go far enough. And in fact, the diagnoses in some sense contribute to an exacerbation of the problem. I think there's a problem of leadership. I think, you see Christian leaders, and I'm going to speak generally here, there are of course many exceptions, but you see Christian leaders going in different directions, some toward a kind of quietism, some toward a religious formalism, seeing the answer in a revival of certain kinds of liturgy or some very particular point of theology. And of course, you see some Christian leaders going into this really strange form of ultra-nationalism. I don't know what we're calling it these days, but heavily politicized kind of movement that sees a political solution as the only solution. That's another thing, leadership. I think related to that is a problem in Christian churches. You see a couple of things happening, and COVID isn't helping. Churches are closing. COVID has aggravated that problem tremendously. Great Christians I know in my family, among my friends, who, although they love church, love being a Christian, are now feeling like, maybe it's not so important to gather physically after all. On the other hand, you see Christian churches that have become heavily commercialized. I go to a Baptist church. Thank God my church is pretty grounded, but you see in many Protestant churches, evangelical churches, a watering down of the essence of what the faith is. I think Lastly, I'll mention, and this is, I think, maybe the most important point, we not only are our educational institutions failing, they have failed as far as I'm concerned. Our Catholic institutions have always, I think, been better than Protestant institutions in terms of effectiveness and really bringing the people in them up to the level that they need to be to lead in this society. But you only have to look at the numbers to see that many of them are closing and facing all kinds of other issues. When it comes to the evangelical world, the world of the part of Christendom that I think is maybe the most connected to Jerusalem by virtue of the fact that they're so deeply connected to the biblical text, you see just a wholesale loss of institutions. Ones that existed and were somewhat good no longer exist. And those that do exist are very expensive. And evangelicals, as a rule, are in a very different socioeconomic category than some other parts of America. So the inability, even when there is a Christian institution, educational institution, for Christians to send their children there is, I think, really kind of the fatal blow from my perspective as far as where the problem lies.
There's a huge amount there to dig into and think through. Maybe before that, we can finish out the picture just a bit, because these are all reasons for worry. What are some reasons for hope? Eric, how do you think about that, having described some of the enormous challenges that that tradition-minded Jews face in America? What kind of strengths do they bring to the table?
Well, look, if you're going to be an institution builder, you have to be hopeful. And I think there are hopeful things that are going on in America today. Look, you yourself, Yuval, in your very important book, described America as a fractured republic. But I think another way of looking at that is America is a federalist republic, which means we have the possibility, state by state, community by community, for renewal. And so the first thing that gives me hope is the important change in the Supreme Court. We have a very different Supreme Court now than we did 4 years ago, a more constitutionalist court, a more federalist-friendly court, a court that I think will open up more room over time, at least is my hope, for states to enact policies that protect religious freedom, that allow communities of faith to flourish. So that's the first thing that gives me hope. I'd say the second thing that I remain very hopeful about is the school choice movement. Robert mentioned quite rightly the importance of religious schools as the nurseries of not only religious attachment, but as I said earlier, of American virtue. I think we're going to see a huge growth in the school choice movement state by state. I think that's been happening for the past many decades anyway. I think the Espinoza decision, a very important decision, has created more room for that. And now when you see a growing amount of discontent with the public school system because of COVID, I think this is going to add fuel to the school choice fire, and I think nothing could be more important for our religious communities. And I think layered on top of that has been a very impressive classical education movement in the Christian world, in the charter school world, and now beginning in the Jewish world as well. Tremendous growth, quietly, not that widely noticed, but whole school systems around the country that are trying to form young people by, reacquainting them, reattaching them to the foundational texts and ideas and virtues of their own tradition. So I think all those things, if you put them together and with the right leadership, give us a basis to be hopeful. I think we are a divided country. I do think in the short term, conservative states can get more conservative and progressive states can get more progressive. I think we have a national debate that's very fractured. But I think the biggest grounds for hope are community-level building of educational institutions that can serve Jewish continuity, Christian continuity, and I would say American continuity, far better than the American public school system in general is serving today. So that's where I'm most hopeful, and that's where I have the greatest sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Robert, how about you? What leaves you hopeful in the face of the challenges that you described, which are no small problems after all?
They're huge problems. I would stipulate for the record everything Eric just said, all of that, definitely. Something he mentioned that I'll embellish a bit is actually the chaos of this moment. And on one hand, it's right, it's the biggest thing that we're worried about. It's the thing that's leading us even to have this conversation. But there's something about that chaos, certainly for the Christian majority, that is important and beneficial, right? Chaos, I sometimes say from great struggle comes great clarity. And I think it's different for the Jewish community because the Jewish community has always been a minority in this country, and so is always aware that there's a difference, that there are things happening in this country that are not necessarily for them, not necessarily good for them. And so I think historically they've been already thinking about how to do things in the alternative. For a majority, I think for a long time, we've been convinced that the culture of our churches has been more or less coterminous with the culture of the country, and it actually was. But as those two trains start to diverge, I think that feeling of separation, of fracturing, as you've written about, is the first step toward reaching something hopeful. So there's something about the chaos that I actually am happy about. I do think, and this is anecdotal in the course of my work, there is a certain kind of neo-biblicism that I see breaking out in lots of parts of the Christian world, and it's not necessarily even rooted in very niche kinds of theology. It's cultural, it's historical, it's moral. I think the founding of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. is one kind of big symbol of the fact that Christians are interested in going back, as it were, to the text. I think in my work, one of the big things we do is take Christian college students to Israel. We started this program called Passages, and we brought thousands of these kids on these trips that combine a traditional pilgrimage experience with insight into what's happening on the ground today. The response, not only from students, but even from universities, the desire to participate in this program has been huge. I mean, the demand, COVID obviously has been a problem, but the demand is massive. And to me, that speaks to a hunger on the part of the Christian community to really get back to where it all started. And lastly, I'll mention the growing reciprocation I see from certain sectors of the Jewish community. I mean, the fact that I'm here speaking at this conference, right, which is a Jewish conference, is to me a sign of hope. And I've seen this just in the short time that I've been doing the work that I do, a real sea change in the Jewish community. A few voices have turned into many voices saying that, notwithstanding all of the things that divide us, right? We're two separate peoples, two separate religions in many ways, but we are Americans, and we do believe in a particular set of values that distinguish us from people who don't see them as valuable. So I think that, to me, symbolizes an opportunity that has really yet to be taken full advantage of.
Eric, let me pick up on something Robert just said, and it came out in everything that you both have said so far, which is this distinction between thinking as a minority culture and a majority culture about these problems we're describing. The American Jewish community is small. You might say we punch above our weight in the culture, but we're small.
Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse.
Yeah, punching is not always good, right?
Yeah, right.
Is there a role for American Jews in enabling a larger revitalization of civic institutions in American life? Or is this a minority community endeavor? Is this about securing and renewing the Jewish community itself in the face of these pressures? How do you, in thinking about what Tikvah does, think about those different purposes?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I think American Jews at our best have to operate on a few different wavelengths. I mean, look, for one, we are interested in the problem of Jewish continuity and trying to figure out how do we preserve our way of life, our culture, the majestic Israelite inheritance within America. And that's been a challenge since the beginning. There's never been a more welcoming diaspora. There's never been a nation, an important nation in the world that has given a fuller place, a truer seat at the table of civic life than the United States. But we are still, as my good friend and one of our speakers, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, likes to emphasize, we are still both strangers and neighbors in America. We have something distinctive of our own culturally to preserve, even as we see ourselves as having a responsibility to participate fully in American life. And I think one of the ways we can participate is something that Robert already alluded to, which is what I call the Hebraic renewal of American civilization itself. Meaning the ideas of the Hebrew Bible, the spirit of the Hebrew Bible, obviously channeled usually through Christianity, but nevertheless very Hebraic, was always an important strand of the American experiment. Michael Novak, the great thinker, wrote a book called On Two Wings, where he talked about how America is both a biblical nation and a Lockean nation. And I think Jews are the living heirs to that Hebraic heritage. And I think we can contribute to America in a distinctive way by calling it back, summoning it back to its Hebraic soul. Now that means we have to believe it. That means the Jews have to take this seriously. That means we have to show by example in our own institutions the vitality of Jewish life. But I think that gives us a purpose. So look, America is still a diaspora. Part of the Jewish heart will always be looking toward Jerusalem, toward Israel, as it should. But I think America is the nation in the world that can proclaim Hebraism throughout the land. I mean, it's no accident that on the Liberty Bell is a passage from Leviticus, right? Proclaim liberty. And I think we can see in America a distinctively Jewish purpose, but we have to seize it. And I think that's one of the opportunities that lie before us, is giving Jews in America a real purpose.
Completely.
Robert, on a related point then, American Christians, as you suggested, certainly feel besieged in some ways in this moment, but they are not a small community like America's Jews. They're, in some respects, of course, the majority here. In any case, are accustomed to feeling like the majority, and maybe now increasingly feel like that majority status is being lost some. How does that question of majority and minority come to be reflected in the way that American Christians are dealing with this moment?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I'll give a full answer. It's a very strange time to be a Christian who believes in Christianity in America, because you're pulled in so many different directions, right? You know about America's Hebraic foundations, and so in a certain sense you want to grab America by the lapels and sort of drag it back by hook or by crook. On the other hand, you realize, well, maybe culture is going in a direction that will leave me in a minority status, and that the best thing I can do is to preserve what I have, conserve what I have, right? I guess that's the conservative position. And on any given day, I'm sort of pulled in both directions, and so is my family, my friends, the people who work with me. And I think it really comes down to your answer to the question, what do you do when a culture turns on you? Because I think that's really what Americans feel, right? We have this, we may not all articulate it this way, but we have this founding myth, right? It's a certain worldview that is biblical. It does come, in fact, from Jerusalem, and we have grown accustomed to that worldview being refracted in different ways, but ultimately manifesting in American public life, and now it's not. In fact, not only is it not, we have a counter myth, so the counter myth of postmodernity. And we feel it sort of eroding our culture on every side. And the big question is, what do you do? How do you respond to that? And I think the mistake that some Christians make, and it's an understandable one, and it's not altogether wrong, there's something valuable about it, but I think that some Christians are overemphasizing the political solution to the problem. And it's sort of been an irony that I've noticed for years, is that the culture war that so many Christians have been fighting for decades has been fought by them in almost every realm except culture, right? There's been fought in the courts, it's been fought in the legislature, the American presidency, fine, important fronts in an overall battle, but they're not the only ones, and in fact, culture is made elsewhere. So I think that that overly political reaction, that desire to just grab America by the throat and drag it back to where it needs to be is ultimately the wrong one. And even if it's a good one, it's not going to really get at the root cause. The better solution is to go back to the kind of conversation that we're having now, which is how do we rebuild the institutions that have broken? I mean, let's be honest, the Protestant institutions and even some Catholic ones that really made America what it was, certainly in the 20th century, just don't exist anymore. The seminaries, the denominational seats, and all of these academic institutions are gone or mostly irrelevant. So for me, going back to that place and trying to find solutions in that realm is a much more, I'll say, sustainable solution than really duking it out, in Congress or somewhere else.
Eric, how do you respond to that challenge from Robert? How much of this has to do with politics? How much, in thinking about the future of the culture, should American Jews who are concerned with the direction it's taking in the terms that you raise be thinking about politics? And to the extent that they shouldn't be, where should the energy be devoted?
Well, look, politics is hugely important. Real politics, meaning the policies that govern the country, as opposed to simply the political theater that has, I think, dominated much of debate in recent years. But I mentioned earlier first the importance of the courts, and the courts are not going to govern the country. But I think the change in the courts, especially, as I said earlier, opening up more room for the renewal of American federalism, are kind of like the preface to being able to engage in this kind of renewal. You've got to give governors and mayors and community builders the room to build. And that means we've got to reshape the structure, the role, the place of religion in American public life. We have to reset where we've gone. We moved way too far, I think, in driving religion out of public life. And I say that as a Jew living in a country that is much more Christian than Jewish. But I think it would be healthy for an American governor to stand up and say, look, we believe in school choice not only as a rescue mission for underprivileged kids who are getting terrible educations. It is that, and it should be that. But it's also a rescue mission for our religious communities. And to me, that's not endorsing a particular establishment of a particular religion. It's going back to the old Washingtonian idea that without religious morality and religious institutions, American life itself will be in trouble. The truth is the establishment today is a kind of progressivism that is dominating the public schools. School choice is a case for pluralism, including giving religious people a seat at the table. So I think politics is very important to try to create room for community-level institution builders to thrive and flourish. The footprint of the government in America is large. The federal government, the state government, that footprint has got to be restructured and reformed in a way that oases of religious flourishing can take root. That's why I think politics is so important.
I would agree with that. I think the local point is really key. And one of the positive outcomes, I think, from COVID, and we'll see where it goes if it lasts, but people have been forced to become more local. I've always asked myself, how do you get from a situation where the country is so hyper centralized, right? And it's just been the trend this past 50 years back to a more federal structure. It may take an eruption from outside, like COVID, to do that. I don't know if it'll stick, but I've seen traces of that, of people kind of getting back more to where they live, to their smaller institutions. So there's some hope there too, I think.
And in the way that you conceive of the problem, Robert, how much of the challenge for American Christianity is bringing people back to faith? And how much of it is building institutions, as we're talking about here? How do you think about the distinction between those?
It's a great point, and I'll be that guy, and I'll say that none of this works if substantial numbers of Americans are not brought back to faith. I mean, it's really as simple as that. I know from a Jewish perspective, there's not the most positive correlation with Christians becoming more Christian and Jewish welfare, but I think America does have a track record, and I think it's clear that when American Christians are more Christian, which is to say biblically Christian, if we want to call it that, good things happen for them, but also for everyone. It's the irony, right, of progressivism, is that in dismantling the Christian Hebraic institutions that we've built, they think that they're actually achieving more freedom, and what they actually get is less. So I think that, for me, part of this has to be about the church. It can't just be about educational institutions. It can't just be about politics. One of the reasons why America looked the way that it looked in the early part of the 20th century was because of great awakenings and revivals. I'm from upstate New York. It was the cauldron of this outpouring of religion at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that really shaped the culture of America for decades and decades, and set up all those institutions that we were referring to earlier. So there's something here that is in fact spiritual, and it's hard to strategize. It's hard to draw on a whiteboard. There's a spiritual need in this country. I think people are feeling it, again, to the point I made earlier about the chaos breeding some clarity. And COVID's been a speed bump, but my hope is that when people become disillusioned with politics, as we all seem to be these days, they will in fact go back to the place where the answers are. And I say that as a Christian who believes in my faith. And only from there can all of the other things be built. It's really the beginning.
Well, we are getting toward the end of our time, so I wonder if we can conclude by getting specific and concrete. Eric, how do you think about the strategy for reforming and renewing or founding the kinds of institutions that we need? How are you in your work thinking practically about what to do now, what to do next?
So look, our work, Tikvah, is really focused on trying to create models to educate young Jews, especially those that have the ambition, the character, the potential to really emerge as future leaders of the Jewish community. And one of the innovations, of the COVID period for us has been trying to start much younger. And so we've, for the first time, started working with kids in 7th, 8th grade, all the way up through high school and college, and trying to immerse them in the Jewish heritage and Western civilization and the great ideas that are so important for leaders to understand if they're going to grapple with the challenges of their time. But I think that's got to be a first step. I think that the big ambition has to be to build Jewish schools, Jewish colleges, new Jewish institutions that work closely with our Christian friends and allies, that can either renew and reform or perhaps replace some of our failing institutions today. And we obviously have to do that in the places where Jews are clustered, like New York and New Jersey and California. But if I were thinking as a grand strategist, for American Jewry, I'd also be thinking seriously about Florida, about Tennessee, about Missouri, about Texas, because I think we're going to see a demographic shift. And I think as states like New York and California get increasingly progressive, perhaps less friendly to communities of faith, these other states will perhaps hopefully become more friendly to those communities. And I think what you need is to put enough talent there in those red state communities so that it becomes over time a magnet for Jewish life. And I don't say that simply cheerfully, meaning one doesn't simply celebrate the fact that America is a fractured republic, but we are. And so you have to reckon with reality. And if you're reckoning with that reality, I think Jews have to take seriously the importance of building strong cultural and educational institutions in those parts of the country where their value systems are much more in sync with their fellow Christians and other peoples of faith who want to live traditional lives in our increasingly untraditional age. So if I were thinking strategically, that's where I would focus.
Robert, how about you? Taking in the broad sweep of these challenges and the potential that you pointed to also, and just thinking day to day about what Philos does and what it's all about, what steps are you looking to take?
It's there's so much to do. It's often hard to sort through and make priorities, but a lot of it is doubling down on the things that we're doing. I mentioned this Passages program, bringing these Christian college students on trips. I'll be honest, a lot of them come because it's a cheap trip and they get to have a cool experience with the kids in their class and their college, but almost inevitably something happens there, and it's something that you can't duplicate, something you can't do on Zoom, something you can't even do necessarily in your local church. There's something just powerful about the experience of going to Jerusalem, and it sparks all kinds of things, none of which you can really predict. So doing more of that, just giving them that initial sort of jolt to the system. But on the back end, there's so much that needs to be done in terms of follow-up. We said the word Hebraic lots of times in this conversation. I sometimes say that what I'm doing at Philos is really just my attempt to impose my own spiritual journey on other people. And it's kind of funny, but the reality is I was not Christian in any real way. I was, in fact, some kind of nihilist, very disillusioned with the West and cynical, all that type of stuff. And my path to faith actually came through reading the Hebrew Bible, through studying Hebrew. And one of the things I'm asking myself a lot lately is, how do I simulate that experience, even in a small way, in local churches? Because if Christianity is part of the solution, then that solution needs to happen in local churches. They're the engine of Christianity. So what is it that can be done for pastors, for youth pastors, for people in the pews to even, to learn a few words of Hebrew and thereby sort of gain some entree into this whole heritage that they've mostly lost. I mean, there's a lot there to talk about, but there's after school programs that can be done, especially for those who can't afford a full Christian education, paying something smaller to a few days a week, go to a local place, a physical place, and sit with someone, perhaps someone who's Jewish, someone who's an Israeli, who actually teaches them words and does so by studying traditional biblical texts. There's a universe of things that could be done in that realm. And so in addition to the experiences, it's that kind of educational content, stuff that's easily transferable into local churches that I think needs to be part of this conversation as well.
Eric Cohen, Robert Nicholson, thank you for a great conversation, and thank you above all for all that you're doing. And thanks to all of you for watching.
Yuval, thanks so much.
Thank you, Yuval.